I tend to think that the inability, generally speaking, of the left to find an alternative to respond to that question, to that cry, and to that even rage, that whether it was justified or not, it was there. It was there. It was undeniably there. I think the lack of to respond to that or to even try to take it seriously is not even to respond. Maybe it's even before to take that seriously as one of the most, I think, significant factor that allowed the other parties, other far-right parties, other narratives to sort of like fill that void.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean Fettig. I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in how our government and our politicians influence our lives, but also how our personal stories influence our politics. In this podcast, I may focus on topics in the news, but this is not punditry. Instead, I dive deep into issues and stories with my guests, behind the headlines, beyond the basic narrative that is often crafted by the media and our politicians, to help us better understand each other and why we think and feel the ways we do. Welcome to the second season of Deep Dive. I'm super excited about this season and what I've got on deck for y'all. But before we jump into this together, I want to prime you about how I'm approaching this season. First, you'll notice throughout the season that I'm touching on some of the same themes as I did in the first. And what I'm doing is diving deeper. So, by way of example, last season I spoke to Dr. Sasha Polikow-Saransky about the rise of nationalism and xenophobia in global politics. In the first two episodes of this season, I'm focusing on this phenomenon and the rise of the right wing in two specific countries that have elections coming up over the next few weeks. You'll notice this approach throughout the season. Second, in the first season, I really limited myself to discussions about politics, political science, democracy, government, because that's what I know and it's truly what I'm interested in. But I'm interested in a lot of things, and I want to talk about that stuff too. So in this season, I'm going off the rails a bit. And I'm going to venture into some territories of interest other than politics, maybe even into areas for which I have no real background or expertise. So yes, of course, there will be a hefty share of politics and related topics, don't worry. But I will also be exploring other things, talking to people engaged in things outside the political realm, like travel, music, and I'll even occasionally turn the microphone, onto myself. Finally, I want to acknowledge the feedback that I've gotten for the first season. It was and is overwhelmingly positive and affirming, and I want to thank all of you for listening and engaging. As we head into this second season, I'd like to ask that if you enjoy this podcast, or you think that a friend of yours might enjoy it, or even just a particular episode, please do share it with them, or give it a like on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help to spread the word. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at Deep Dive with Sean, on Twitter at Deep Dive Sean, and or subscribe to Deep Dive with Sean C. Fettig at YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Okay, now that that's behind us, let's talk about this premiere episode of the second season. So you may or may not know that Italy is having elections in just 2 days' time, on Sunday, September 25th. And all polls leading into the final stretch suggest that the far-right party, Brothers of Italy, is going to win enough shares of the vote that they will form the next government under the Prime Ministership of the leader of their party, Giorgia Meloni. This is happening just after elections in France, in which the far-right leader Marine Le Pen came closer than ever to winning the election, and immediately following elections this past week in Sweden, in which the far-right parties led by Ulf Kristerrson's center-right moderates have won enough seats to form the next government. This came after promising during the campaign to crack down on immigration and increase prison sentences. This is a watershed moment for Sweden, perhaps for Europe overall, as Sweden is consistently one of the most progressive nation-states in Europe. Which begs the question, what does Italy have in store for us? To answer that, today I'm talking to Italian journalist and 2019 Nieman Fellow at Harvard, Mattia Ferraresi. He's the managing editor of the Italian newspaper Domani, and his work has been featured in numerous outlets, including New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and Foreign Policy magazine. You know, I want to say at the top, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was wide-ranging. We discussed the structure of Italian government, how the past informs its government now, how liberal democracy has evolved in Italy, how the left has failed to address the concerns of the electorate, leaving open an avenue for the right to exploit, what's driving the electorate in Italy now, and what we might expect from a far-right government. I also want to thank Italian journalist Giorgio Giglioni, who was not featured in this episode, but assisted me by providing a lot of critical background and context about Italian politics and government. More information about his work can be found in the show notes. Let's do a deep dive. Mattia, thank you for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
So there's a significant, and by significant, I mean consequential election scheduled for September 25th in Italy. And for all intents and purposes, it appears that the far right might be headed for a victory. But in order to get there, I'd really like to establish a bit of framework to help us understand Italian government and why we might be where we are. So I guess I would characterize Italian government as having been somewhat fragile in the past few years, with a number of governments being relatively unstable, having fallen or dissolved. And one, I wonder if you agree that that's an appropriate characterization. And two, if you do, what's been happening in Italy in the past decade or so?
Not only I do agree with your statement, I would add further, instability of government is pretty much a big and deep feature of Italian politics, and has been, in a way, always been like that, and has been very clear and very pronounced in the past 30 years at least. But it was true also in the 4 years after World War II, which the end of World War II marked the beginning of the Italy as a republic, after of course, fascism and the monarchy. Uh-huh. So I would go even further than your point. The instability and a typically quite quarrelsome politics is absolutely part of the political culture in Italy for many reasons. I would just tell you one, which is the most obvious probably. For sure, the system, the institutional system, it is designed in a way that prevents encroaching of power, which was clearly what the fathers of the Constitution had in mind when they designed the new Constitution after, of course, the regime, the fascist regime. So in a way, that instability is by design.
Which is interesting because for those of us that study politics and government, stability is a key feature of building trust amongst the electorate. That when the people feel as if their government is stable, they have more trust in it. And I wonder if the instability of government in Italy contributes to a certain amount or a lack of trust or a certain amount of skepticism in its own government, and if that then has provided an opportunity for the rise of the right in Italy.
I think you're absolutely right. It's absolutely the case. The relationship between instability and trust or mistrust is pretty evident. And if we look at the past 30 years, more or less, the 3 decades after sort of the collapse of what we call the First Republic, which collapsed in 1992, which was marked by the dialectic between Christian democracy and the Communist Party. So it was like a almost perfectly bipolar system. That system collapsed. After that, what we've seen is are waves of political leaders and political parties basically offering to the electorate different version of some dramatic change. And Silvio Berlusconi in 1994, he sort of like launches what he called the liberal revolution, where liberal is to be meant in the European sense. because it was a conservative, of course, but it was like a liberal in the sense of Ronald Reagan is a liberal, small L. And then you had Matteo Renzi, the former leader of the Democratic Party, like starting his career as with the nickname Demolition Man, because his whole idea was like throw out the past and start anew. And then the Five Star Movement, a populist, left-wing kind of anti-corruption populist party that they want promises to start over again. And then the League, Matteo Salvini, far-right anti-immigration party that had a huge success in 2018, so just a few years ago. And then also that sort of deflated rather quickly. And now the rise of a different brand, more nationalistic brand of Brothers of Italy, which is the party of Giorgia Meloni that is leading in the polls, that has clearly the better chance to become the first party and the leader of a right-wing coalition that will most likely be tasked to form a new government. So in a way, you're seeing these waves where the content, the political offer changes, but sort of like the framework is sort of still the same. And that, in my view at least, signals a lack in trust, a total lack in trust, to the point that the electors, the voters, every time they do tend to jump on the new party or the new movement that is promising this dramatic change that never happens, and then they're disappointed, and then they move on to something else. With one caveat, in this trajectory that I tried to describe briefly, what is a constant there is also like the lower and lower turnout. So there's a clear sign in that of disaffection and people feeling disenfranchised and not represented and have political demands that are not met by an adequate political offer.
So I want to follow this train of thought to Giorgia Meloni. But before we get there, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with Francis Fukuyama's argument in The End of History, that essentially after the fall of communism, that, we had reached this kind of, and I'm really truncating and simplifying this form of liberal government was the final form of government for all of time. And it strikes me that was at the time that Fukuyama wrote that was also at the time of the rise of Berlusconi in Italy. And to some sense, Berlusconi in that movement then almost stands in contrast to Fukuyama's argument, right? Like Berlusconi is beginning a new rise of this kind of conservatism. And as you mentioned, Italy has a complicated history with authoritarianism. The obvious marker here is Italy under Mussolini and then throughout the Second World War. And I'm wondering if you could maybe expound on how the right has managed to go from what would seem to be a defeated ideology after the war to what appears to be today kind of a powerful and attractive force in Italian politics. Like, what's the allure?
Yeah, I do understand your argument, and I'm familiar with Fukuyama's framework about the end of history. But where I do disagree with you, I think, is to put Berlusconi and Berlusconi's experience in the 90s, so the early Berlusconi, on that side of the argument. I think, on the contrary, my view, and it could be, I think, counterintuitive for many that have been followed, like Italian politics, I think the early Berlusconi in 1994 offered something that was perfectly in line with the end of history. Mm-hmm. It was the embodied that idea that the history is over, and Italy in a way was a perfect example. It was like two bipolar system run by the Christian democracy, so like a clear and a staple of the 19th century political culture, and the Communist Party that was like defeated, of course, with the collapse of Soviet Union, and it was the strongest Communist Party in Western Europe. Uh-huh. So it was a very extremely significant presence in the life of the country. All that collapses for many reasons I'm not gonna go into in terms of details, but Berlusconi rose at that time not as a Trump-like nationalistic figure, It was kind of the opposite. It was in the vein of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. That was his brand. It was all about free market, enterprise, and looking at the future. And it got sunshine in his pocket. And he didn't care much about social issues or, new rights, all this kind of thing. It was agnostic about it. So it was not in line at all, even with the ethos of the Christian democracy. Himself personally, although his party hosted a number of different sensitivities and so on. But my point is, Berlusconi's trajectory has been long, and in a way, I think we tend to interpret Berlusconi's sort of parable as something, as we are, I think, influenced by the inglorious and terrible, in many ways, end of his career and his sex scandals and his absolutely egomania and all the things that Berlusconi has been famous for. But early on, his political project and his political sort of culture he embodied in a way without even reflecting about, without even being aware, was, I think, certainly part of a small L liberal tradition in the ways described by Francis Fukuyama, which he understood that liberalism could come in many forms, there's liberalism on the right and on the left, but still within the perimeter of liberalism as the sort of ultimate sort of super ideology that encompasses everything. So this is where I think I do disagree, in the sense that, in a way, Meloni and his very nationalistic and post-fascist brand of politics, which is part of a tradition, is a tradition that is in collision with the sort of the spirit or the main ideas and feature of the early Berlusconi in 1994. Although now they are allied and part of the same coalition, but this is politics. This is strategic and tactical marriage, but it's of two very different, I think, in terms of roots, in terms of ideological and cultural roots, two very different components.
I often hear from people, and they might be simplifying for my, American ears. So I have often heard, in trying to explain Giorgia Meloni, that she's having her moment because Berlusconi is simply too old. But I wonder if this is missing something else that might be happening, which is that Berlusconi is actually too moderate for the electorate this time around, that Meloni is more accurately reflecting the sentiment of the far right or of conservatives in Italy, and that Berlusconi may be the precursor, but not necessarily the contemporary standard bearer of conservatism in Italy today. And then maybe we could use that to begin to shift to talk about, the rise of Giorgia Meloni and her party, Brothers of Italy, and what their appeal to Italians is.
Yeah, I think in Italy, and the rise of Giorgia Meloni sort of illustrates what's happening across the world at large, and in Europe in many ways, and in Latin America for a season. I think it's sort of part of the same spirit, the same ethos. The rise of course, a new forms of nationalism and far-right ideology, a new brand of extreme conservatism, or whatever you want to call it, has been clearly a global phenomenon, as we know, especially from 2016 on. Of course, Trump's election mark, that moment in which this is sort of is huge, it's big. Mm-hmm. It's something global. So I tend to read Meloni's rise within that framework that clearly affected Europe, all over Europe. I don't have to mention, I think, Marine Le Pen, that despite not being able to get to the presidency, every time she ran, she sort of really increased her following, and really consolidate her brand. And so we can have many examples of that. They have ups and downs, of course, these nationalists all around. It's not black and white. But I tend to read Meloni within that framework. Having said that, it's interesting because this is a second wave of far-right nationalism for Italy. Because the first wave was represented by the League, the party led by Matteo Salvini, which used to be the deputy prime minister and minister of interior in a very weird populist coalition. But my point is that Salvini was the first catalyst of this sort of like global tendency, and he won, and he affirmed himself, and he was able to get like a significant consensus. Keep in mind, in 2018, he got like over 35% of the vote, which for the way the Italian political system is designed is absolutely a huge victory. It's extremely high. It's something Meloni would not probably be able to replicate in terms of number. But then Salvini, as I said before, in this kind of like weird waves dictated by the structural instability of Italian political system, and for many other reasons, including his own limitations in terms of political skills and his ability to lead, and his complete inability to deliver when it was a government, it deflated completely. So now what we're seeing is Giorgia Meloni like really tapping from that electorate, really tapping from that. I don't want to underestimate with this her ability or the ability of the message of Brothers of Italy to sort of convince and penetrate and galvanize an electorate. What I'm trying to say is that an electorate with the nationalistic and sort of far-right and populist inclinations was already there before Giorgia Meloni. But that electorate couldn't find in Matteo Salvini sort of a proper representative or a credible one. And so now a lot of the same people are turning to Giorgia Meloni. Keep in mind, last election that Italy had, last political election, Brothers of Italy got 4% of the vote. 4. Now, I mean, the polls we have available so far now, by law, you can't publish polls anymore in the 2 weeks leading to the election. But the last polls before that, talking about 25, 26, 27%. That's the extent. She must be, I think she has to be extremely grateful to Matteo Salvini's failure for this very impressive rise.
And I think to for listeners that are maybe not steeped in parliamentary forms of government or multi-party forms of government, 23, 24, 25, 26% of the vote is really significant.
Is well enough to be the leading party and so to get the responsibility to form a new government. Absolutely.
Right. Many explanations of the things that animate the right in Europe are threefold. There are like three tenets that are often attributed to the right. One is its relationship with the European Union. The second is immigration, and the third is social issues. So particularly things like traditionalism and rights of like the LGBT community, and maybe others. But I'm wondering if maybe we could tackle each of these in turn.
Sure.
Over the past, especially since the global kind of recession in 2008, many people and many governments in Europe have been somewhat critical of the European Union and the European Central Bank, and kind of how it handles and relates with democratic governance of its member states. And I think that somebody that comes to mind for me is the former Greek Minister of Finance, Yanis Varoufakis, as being specifically and particularly critical. The central bank actually motivates and empowers kind of anti-democratic far-right movements because functionally the central bank stifles democratic policies that have been approved within states to manage their own internal finances. And this is just one argument, but I'm wondering, do you agree with this, that the European Union, especially how it approaches finances and its oversight of finances within member states, provides fertile ground for far-right nationalist movements? And if so, specific to Italy, how has it influenced politics?
I tend to agree. I do think there's a kernel of truth, at least, in what you're suggesting in terms of the relationship between the ECB and, in general, the EU institutions, and a sort of like a discontent and forms of rage that the far right has been very clever and shrewd in funneling and turning into like consensus. I think there is, and this is especially true in the sort of the southern side of Europe, and in Italy specifically, has been particularly true after 2011, which marked I think, in my view, a big turning point for Italian politics. Because at that point, because of the request and the particularly bad situation in which it was Italy in terms of that, and of course after what happened to Greece, but you could not replicate what happened to Greece and Italy, because Italy is the third economy in the EU, so that would be meaning major collapse with shockwaves throughout the whole continent and the whole union. So at that point, there was clearly and openly a push by the so-called Troika and the ECB to do something about that, which that something turned out to be sort of make the current government at that point, fall under the tremendous amount of pressure that came for the yields on Italy's bond that reached like an insane disparity with the German bond, which is the benchmark, and that clearly is a big benchmark for a country's financial stability. So the result of it was a gentle or less gentle push to a government that was, however we want to judge it politically, I was pretty critical of that government, very critical of that government. But that government was replaced basically under the pressure of the institution, or at least it was heavily perceived like that. Somebody else over in Brussels and in Frankfurt is deciding who's going to lead the country, despite what the voters wanted or voted for. And that brought like a technocratic government. And this time around, a specifically technocratic. It was strictly technocratic. It was not made by any means by any politicians, although all the forces in the parliament, of course, contributed to that and supported that. They had to. There was no choice. But there was like Mario Monti, so like former EU commissioner, famous professor of economics, led like a group of technocrats and experts in order to sort of deal with the crisis and basically like cuts and new reform and huge sacrifices. So I'm telling you all this because I think for Italy in particular, that moment, even psychologically, marked a moment of huge and generalized skepticism toward the EU in general, as a feeling, as a conviction, or as something that is in the back of your mind. Because in that moment, everybody saw that there was a specific political implication and consequence to what somebody else was deciding, somebody else was dictating. I think if you're following this narrative, it's easy to see where it can go forward. It can go in like Europe, it's against us, and Europe is dominated by central and northern country, and specifically by the big power in Europe, Germany, against peoples in the south and countries in the south of Europe that they cannot govern themselves and handle themselves. They're not responsible financially, and they cannot manage properly the resources, and they have no systems and institutions that can be effective in doing that. And so somebody else has to step in. I'm not saying that I agree with that. I'm just laying out the reasoning that has been sort of trickled down and percolated rather deeply into sort of the psychology of the country, definitely. And And definitely that's also a characteristic that all the far-right and nationalist party in Italy had and still having, plus the Five-Star Movement. So even populist but not nationalist forms like the Five-Star Movement, which is this hybrid, hard to define type of movement, but definitely is not in the nationalistic framework, but more on the left side of the spectrum, definitely tapped into that narrative. They thrived in that narrative. So there's I think it was a huge factor in it. Then we can go more specifically into what Giorgia Meloni thinks about Europe, which is, I think, she's very ambiguous about it, but I don't want to take too much time on that.
I think Meloni was less ambiguous about this when she wasn't so close to winning. Mm-hmm. And it seems in the past year or so, she's become more ambiguous, which I think makes sense, right? If she's trying to, appeal to a larger electorate. But something else that strikes me is, I think across Europe, so this isn't specific to Italy, the right and nationalists have found their response to, ECB policy and ECB intervention in member states. They have found their response and they found their position that seems to resonate with their electorate. And what you would hope in a balanced government is that the left has a response that also maintains some type of autonomy for each of their member states, that, ensures that the ECB is not intervening in member state policies to such a degree that it's countervening democratically enacted policies, but that the left, in effect, in Europe, again, not specific to Italy, is really struggling with how to do that.
Absolutely. I think one of the main narrative and the big topic in that sense about the rise of like far right or nationalist party or hybrid populist type of movement is definitely a significant part of that, of the reason why is certainly the left leaving a vacuum and leaving like a void. There's a lot there to be said about it, but I tend to think that the inability, generally speaking, of the left to find an alternative to tap or to respond to that question, to that cry, and to that even rage that whether it was justified or not, it was there. It was undeniably there. I think the lack of the inability to respond to that or to even try to take it seriously. It's not even to respond. Maybe it's even before to take that seriously is one of the most, I think, significant factor that allowed the other parties, other far-right parties, other narratives to sort of like fill that void. Absolutely. Italy in particular, if you want to like get more specific, I think the Democratic Party, which is the larger party in the left and basically the sole party in the left, and there are like other small parties that are in the same coalition, interestingly, never had a significant sort of side on his left or a left wing or a more radical wing that tackle those questions. And this isn't the case, for example, in France, where instead there was like a significant attempt by, for example, Mélenchon to do that, and it proved to be somehow successful, although in a minority position, but it proved to be successful in a way in the US to, at least in my view, the radical wing of the left was able to steer a little bit the agenda of the Democrats a little bit toward the left, which it was something significant, even though Bernie Sanders didn't get elected as a president. But you can have different goals. One is like to get to the power, and the other is to sort of steer the agenda and sort of to shape a little bit the agenda according to your priorities. But my larger point is that mostly in Europe, I think the the left failed in even taking those kind of complaints and this, in general, dissatisfaction seriously.
Another indicator, perhaps the first indicator, that the far right or nationalism might be on the rise in a country or in a region seems to come, well, first and strongest from what I would argue are relatively stable countries that border unstable countries. So countries that are, the first to maybe receive refugees in times of crisis. But on the other hand, the left in Italy has kind of moderated its own policies, I think, in recent years, tacking, kind of to the center on immigration. I'm wondering if this has in effect neutralized immigration as a divisive issue in Italy, or if immigration is still impacting contemporary politics in this election cycle.
I think in this election cycle I'm not going to say it's irrelevant, but definitely is not a central issue. Nobody, not even Meloni, is heavily campaigning on that. Nobody. Immigration was extremely significant and probably the single issue the League won over in 2018 and before that. Keep in mind, let's put things in perspective. In that moment, there was like a huge crisis, a huge migratory crisis in the Mediterranean Sea, and because of like the war in Syria and what happened in Libya in 2011, we saw, of course, we all remember 2015, 20 to 2017, 18, Mediterranean Sea became like a cemetery, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And that was like heavily instrumentalized by the far right. At the same time, paradoxically, or almost paradoxically, in the cases of Italy, it was a left-wing government that sort of, with a very controversial agreement with the Libyan Coastal Guard, was able to mitigate the number of people leaving from Libya. And so, of course, the people arriving in Italy. So in a way, it was, as you said, the left in that case moved a lot to the center. A lot of people would say that they moved to the right in that specific thing. But politically, in that moment, it was absolutely huge. But keep in mind that Trump, now after 4 years of Trump government, I think our memory is so filled with so many things he did wrong, mm-hmm. that it's hard to remember how it was his campaign in 2015 and 16. But it was like mostly around 3 words: build a wall. That was it. Mm-hmm. That mm-hmm. was the spirit of that time. That was the thing, the fuel that made the engine of populists and nationalists everywhere move. It was true to Italy too, but to give you a reference, 2016 and 2017 in Italy, the average number of people reaching Italy's coast, it was around 200,000 per year. Today, that number is cut in less than half. It's very different also in terms of magnitude of the problem to address and the issue to address. And so I don't think in this cycle it's big. Even Giorgia Meloni, the one thing she has been insisting on is what she calls improperly, but I think it's on purpose, is a way of like building a message called naval blockade. And this is what she proposed, like stopping the boats, and naval blockade, of course, in the sense of like boat bringing migrants. She's not even talking about that anymore, or not that much. For sure, it's not the central theme, and it's not the central theme for Matteo Salvini either, which thrived on that. So in my view, it could be, I don't want to oversimplify it. I think immigration, in terms of like being like a really hot central issue that really moved voters, I think it has been true in those specific circumstances in those years, and the far right was extremely clever to exploit that. Now I don't think it's nowhere near a top priority in people's mind. We can argue that has been surpassed by many other crises that we're dealing with. Certainly immigration is not at the center of anybody's thoughts. Let me add just one thing about immigration, which is, I think, slowly people are like realizing, and even politicians slowly are doing that. That demography it's a really enormous issue for places like Europe in general, places like Italy in particular, which is particularly as a low fertility, and historically, and this has been an ongoing trend and a seemingly unstoppable one. The truth is that to make it sustainable, like the really hard truth, we need immigration. That's it. This very simple sort of fact is sort of like becoming, I think, slowly something that people are considering. And so this is part of the equation too.
So the third leg, I suppose, of nationalism or the far-right movement in Europe that I'm alluding to is social issues. And so it's been interesting to me how right-wing and nationalist parties in Europe have created, well, globally, have created coalitions in different ways. In some, the coalitions have actively reached out to the LGBT community and to women as well, to include them. And we've seen that in places like in France and in Denmark and the Netherlands. But in other places, and here I would place Brazil and the United States, the right wing has actively targeted the LGBT community as being like enemies of the state or enemies of tradition. And in Italy, Meloni's been vocal in the past about her opposition to rights for the LGBT community. I think as of late, she's tried to temper that a little bit as well. But I guess I have two questions here. What is the coalition that the right is pulling together in Italy? Who is this electorate? And then specifically to the LGBT community, does that community have something to worry about under a Meloni prime ministership?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's not easy to answer, I think, because there's a lot of factors are blended in what Meloni is talking about. Let's try to separate few issues. The one is where Meloni stands, like personally, and in terms of positioning, official positioning of the party. I think we can say there are a few general conviction and a general positioning affirming sort of like traditional values and being like in favor of like only marriage between men and women and being against any form of civil unions or gay marriage or any type of this of like right of civil rights when it comes, generally speaking, to gender and family. So there is a sort of traditionalist positioning, broadly speaking. Whether this is deep-rooted in her specific culture and in the specific culture of the party, I'm very skeptical of. Because that discourse, which is made mostly to appeal to certainly conservative Catholics, of course. Italy is like a Catholic country, so a culturally Catholic country, heavily secularized, but not as secularized as other countries in Northern Europe or in Central Europe. Definitely not so. So there are a sort of like remnants of a certain attitude shaped by Catholicism. This positioning is something relatively recent for her. Relatively recent, meaning her tradition and the Brothers of Italy tradition, which is rooted in the post-fascist tradition, on social issues, tended to be historically way more libertarian and way more like we don't really care about that much. Yes, they do care in the sense of like family as a social thing that is important to keep, but they were not in that sense so committed, for example, on other issues like abortion. It was less significant in their narrative back in the days. Now it became more, and I think it's mostly because she's trying to target certain type of conservative and Catholics that are responsive to that message and they care about these issues, and they probably tend to think that these issues are the the most important and the most defining for their identity, and therefore they're going to vote for whoever promises to ban or not allow gay marriage or to restrict abortion in some form, although is, I think, deeply rooted in law in Italy, and not even Giorgia Meloni has like any serious plan to dismantle that. So you have this mix. You have this mix there. It's definitely part of the message and the platform, but definitely something she's not really. It's not really in her political DNA, I would say, or in the political DNA of the sort of culture, political culture that she's coming from. Whether this is successful in terms of like moving and galvanizing voters and attracting voters, hard to say. I'm personally, and it's really, this is almost, I think, impossible to poll, or extremely difficult to poll and to understand, or maybe we will understand more after the vote. But my gut feeling is that specific message on social issues is not particularly successful. It's not the one will allow her to enlarge her coalition or to get like a lot of people mobilized. And part of I'm partly answering indirectly to your question about whether the LGBT community has something to be scared about. Of course, they are. This community is scared, but in my view, and I don't want to sound too insensitive to anyone, but in my view, there's not much to fear about, in the sense that I don't see a huge and serious commitment by a government run by Giorgia Meloni to tackle those issues first, or to give any priority to that, or to give any particular consideration to that, or to make like a huge battle to create an environment that is actively hostile to the LGBT community. I struggle to see that. I hope I'm right, of course, in a way. But to me, this is, if I'm trying to read her positioning and sort of like read that in context and keep in mind her political culture, where she comes from, where the party comes from, I don't see that being anywhere near a list of top priorities of a government possibly led by Giorgia Meloni.
So then, all of that being said, I suppose a little context here. So recently, the former Italian Prime Minister, Enrico Letta, predicted that a win for the right in Italy would lead to such policy changes in country that Italy would come to resemble Poland and Hungary. I mean, and what he's saying, there's other European countries that have, in recent years taken dramatic steps away from small L liberal democracy, that essentially Italy is at risk of becoming, and this is, I think, his language, a B-class European country. Is this alarmism, or is there something there?
Of course, this is the big topic of the campaign, and Enrico Letta, who is the leader of the Democratic Party and the main rival of Giorgia Meloni, put at the center of the message this. He actually refused to articulate any different vision for the country, and he focused on a openly negative campaign, suggesting exactly what he summarized: Italy will become Hungary or Poland, or worse. Mm-hmm. I tend to disagree with that view. I think I'm more a realist in that, and again, I hope I'm right. I think there's a lot of messaging there, and it's absolutely legitimate. I think there are sources of concern if we look closely at who's the base of Giorgia Meloni and who are some of the people surrounding her. I think there are concerns, series of having some extremists there, and that's definitely something to be absolutely warned. But in terms of her being really able to turn so much and twist so much the sort of constitutional guarantees, and to get rid of the check and balance system to the point in which you have a situation like Poland, for example, where the executive power is clearly constraining the judiciary in a way that the EU considered not consistent with the rule of law. That I think is a step too far for, and I'm not saying she does not want to do that. She wouldn't desire to do that. I'm not, hard to say, but maybe she does. Hard to say. I'm not speculating what she dream about, but what she like realistically and possibly do in terms of putting that scenario in practice, I think it's nearly impossible, or extremely unlikely. And I give you like a couple of reasons because there are like different levels. One is, in order to do that, you have to have 2/3 of the parliament. That allows you, it's a majority that allows you to change the constitution without going through a ballot. This is like the way the electoral law is designed and many other factors. It's almost impossible. Let's be more cautious here. It's extremely unlikely. Even if she does it, that would be 2/3 of the parliament of a conservative coalition, which means Meloni plus 2 other parties, and the 3 of them don't like particularly each other. So not necessarily everybody is on board to a constitutional reform. The second thing is that the judiciary power. The judiciary power has been historically in Italy, in post-war Italy, extremely independent. There is a Supreme Court that is not, like in America, is not nominated by politics directly. So as a long tradition of being very independent. And typically the criticism comes from the other side. The judiciary power is too independent. It's so independent that it can push the executive power and the parliament too in their direction, constraining or indicating what parliament should, or bills the parliament should pass, or even putting pressure on the executive. So historically, that power that in the classical formulation should be, quote unquote, the weakest of the power, and Italy proved to be extremely strong. I think that's a sort of like a firewall that is working well. Supreme Court is extremely authoritative. Nobody ever put into question the impartiality of the decision. I think it would require a change that no politician can do, because we don't have a system in which justices are nominated by politics. And so this is, I think, it's very important to keep that in mind, because in other systems things work differently. Even a prime minister in Italy cannot put their hands on the judiciary power, which is like a strong function of control. The other thing is at the European level. Italy is the biggest recipient for Next Generation EU along Greece. We had like more than 750 billion in projects that had been approved under Draghi's government by the EU Commission. It's a huge thing. It's so big that no government would lose that or would jeopardize that effort. So if we talk about in terms of like simple rationality and political rationality, there's really no incentive for Meloni to be in a contentious position with the EU, because we signed a big contract with the EU, and a contract that's worth a lot of billions that we desperately need to sort of jumpstart after the pandemic and in the terrible combination that all the world and especially Europe is going through because of the energy crisis generated by, of course, the war in Ukraine. So I think it's completely against her interest to be in an antagonistic position with the EU, because what her government, if she will be elected and nominated prime minister, will have to deal with. And this is a must. It's not something that she can avoid. Nobody, no matter who is elected, nobody can avoid that. that to me would seem like politically a little bit suicidal, which is political suicide. It's an occurrence in history and in Italian history probably particularly. So I'm not excluding that as a fact that it's impossible. But I tend to think that somehow she will walk the line in that sense because of the number of constraints that she will have to face no matter what the election goes. This is beyond anyone's ability to control.
I think this isn't maybe an answered question already, but I'm asking you for a prediction. Is Giorgia Meloni the next Prime Minister of Italy?
I think so. I think so, based on the fact that she's polling very strongly as a leader of the right-wing coalition. And she made clear that there is a public and specific agreement within the coalition that the first party within the coalition will nominate the prime minister. And I see no chances that she will indicate somebody else. Probably that would be a clever move if you ask me. Very clever politically. That would be to ask somebody else. Less charged, less complicated to handle, more acceptable. But, that's her big historic opportunity. I've never seen a politician not taking it.
Okay, final question. What is something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
I've been reading with an extreme pleasure the books by Joshua Cohen, the Netanyahus, that is only now be translated in Italian, but I read it in English, and I thought it was one of the most amazing reading experience I've had in quite a long time. It was a great alternative to be completely immersed 24/7 in Italian electoral campaign. It's about the story of the father of Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah,
it's about a minor story there's a story told by Harold Bloom, put in a novel. It's absolutely an incredible book to me. Extremely fun and deep.
That book is fiction, but even the nonfiction story of that family is fascinating.
Yeah. And I think I did not do enough research on it, but I think it's heavily based on facts. Also, it's a minor episode, so it's a small thing. It's not the arc of all the family. It's just a minor thing in 1959, as reported by Harold Bloom, which was a character in the story and had to do for absurd reason with Ben-Zion Netanyahu. Absolutely amazing, but I think it's grounded pretty much in fact.
Have you heard about or read, because it's in the same vein, it's like a fictionalized version of him, but Antonio Scarratti's book M?
Yes, of course. No, I think was it translated?
Yeah, so it's apparently it's a trilogy, right?
It is. It's a huge, enormous trilogy and kind of scary in terms of the amount of pages. Yes, of course. It was a big shot. It was a big shot here. I haven't read it though, but truth is that I've been only reading and having good reviews about that being absolutely his masterpiece. So
yeah, chances
are this is a worth read.
Yeah, only M has been translated.
Okay.
So far, so that only matters to me.
Right, but if you survive that, you can enjoy the rest.
I'm well prepared for the rest. Yeah,
exactly.
Mattia Ferraresi, I've really appreciated this conversation. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Sean. It was a pleasure.
All right, so we'll know by the end of the weekend if the polls are right, if the far right in Italy wins, and then we'll begin to see the shape that Italian government might take. And while I agree with Mattia that democratic infrastructure can be a bulwark against the worst populist, nationalist, and xenophobic tendencies, I live in the United States, and I was shaken to my core following the 2020 election and leading up to the transition from the Trump to Biden presidencies. And yes, Italian institutions are designed differently, perhaps more insulated from political meddling, maybe most critically the judiciary. But these shifts in public sentiment toward political figures that embrace the dismantling of liberal democracies and cooperation across and amongst states and protection of individual human dignity has to mean something about a shift in character at both the individual and collective levels. And even if the levees hold, it is incumbent on us to dissect not just the movement on the right, but also the void that the left is leaving for the right to fill, as Mattia referred to it. The question for me is not just what the left is giving up, but why it's giving it up. One hope for the left might be in Brazil, and one leftist that may have a meaningful response and rebuttal to far-right policies may be found in Brazil's ex-president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who's running to replace the far-right Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro, with round 1 of elections scheduled for October 2nd. So next week, I'll be talking to Dr. Robert Vidigal, research data scientist at New York University's Center for Social Media and Politics, about the authoritarian tendency, how we know it when we see it, Brazilian politics, and what we might expect from this upcoming election. Chat soon, folks.